Do you know what a short bus is?
No.
You've heard of the big yellow school bus. Well, this is the short one. It's a salon for the gifted and challenged.
I cease to believe you're
I love sex. We all know that, right? We all know that. The sex feels terrific.
Hey guys, so welcome back. This is now officially week 8 in the course, in the semester, and we are officially halfway through. So congrats to all of us for that, right? And let's get on with this. All right, so for this week, I asked you guys to watch a film from 2006 called Short Bus, and basically what we want to do is sort of through the particular medium and lens of film, or sort of full-length kind of film narrative, ask ourselves a series of questions about how one might kind of try to do something different, represent sexuality in a more kind of subversive form or non-conforming kind of form than a couple of different kind of other mediums, like super kind of like Hollywood box office mainstream film, which clearly this film is not. And on the other hand, another very dominant, as we just recently talked about, form of representing sexuality through a very dominant visual medium, mainstream pornography, all right? I'm going to try to make the argument throughout the course of this lecture, and then we'll do a sort of reaction exercise related to this, that this particular film is quite unique in sort of very carefully in sort of various kind of complicated ways, balancing between those two things, or sort of teetering in a certain kind of interesting way on the line between those two things, right? It's neither mainstream film or mainstream kind of filmic representations of sexuality that you're more likely familiar with, nor, frankly, is it easily categorizable as pornography, right? Even though, as I'm sure you sort of got a sense from watching it, it contains a tremendous amount of non-simulated sexual activity, right? And that's an interesting dividing line in and of itself, the fact that the director chose to use non-simulated, like real sex, right, on film, rather than sort of simulating it in the way that you're sort of more used to in mainstream television series and film and so on, right? So we're in this sort of particular section called sort of like what it would mean to do kind of transgressive representations of sex and sexuality on film. It's a film called Short Bus. I hope that you watched it, and I hope that you watched it without any other people in the room that should not have been watching it with you, or that made you uncomfortable in watching it. It is obviously quite explicit at various moments. There's lots of sex in it. It's unsimulated, and therefore like not the kind of thing that a lot of people are used to. There's a big flag about this on the syllabus, so hopefully you didn't make that mistake. But I don't want to sort of try to sell it to you as like the best film in the world. It's not the best film in the world, all right? It's an independent kind of art film by this director, John Cameron Mitchell, released in 2006. It actually went to the Cannes Film Festival and did pretty well. But, you know, it's always kind of had somewhat mixed reviews. The acting is not the greatest at times, and you can kind of get a sense of that. But we are in the realm of independent film, right? So you can't necessarily expect to kind of just be immediately presented with the same old typical kind of celebrity actor characters who've kind of perfected their craft, right, in saying the way. A lot of the people acting in this film are basically either amateur actors or sort of kind of lower level actors, right? But that's the sort of realm in which this particular kind of filmmaking takes place, right? I'm not going to try to sell it to you as the best film ever. I am going to try to sell it to you in the sense of like it's a film that is doing something radically different than what is typically and normatively commonly done with representing sexuality on either of that kind of duality that we just talked about, either the sort of mainstream kind of Hollywood box office kind of film that you're more likely to have seen in big theaters, right, and so on, and, you know, generated a lot of cash, right, with a lot of kind of very familiar kind of Hollywood formulas, or on the other hand, sort of like mainstream dominant forms of pornography, right, that we talked about last week. It's sort of, you know, very carefully and interestingly kind of coming down in between those two things. And we're going to try to sort of spell out a series of ways in which that's happening. So first of all, just on setting, this is clearly, you probably got a sense of that from very early on in the movie. New York City, post 9/11. There's not a whole lot of kind of subtext going on there, but there's a little bit about this being kind of post 9/11, kind of relatively recent kind of PTSD kind of New York City in that particular context. It comes up at a couple of times in the movie. And it's a series of different kind of storylines revolving around a series of different kind of relationships and the sexuality that is part of those relationships that start to get interwoven. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But one central recurring feature and almost a kind of central setting, it almost becomes a kind of character in and of itself, becomes alive in and of itself, is this place called the Short Bus Club, right? Which is essentially a kind of underground sex club. That they all start kind of meeting in, and where their kind of stories get further and further kind of interwoven, right? The various kind of main protagonists and these other kind of supporting characters that come in as kind of centrally supporting kind of figures, right, in the storyline. But the Short Bus Club, right, the name of it is Short Bus, is a space that is itself radically transgressive, obviously, insofar as it's an underground sex club. There's sort of basically kind of people engaging in public forms of sexuality in this club, as well as other social activities, music, right, little talks, right, or sort of conversational settings, little sort of other sort of social spaces that are not necessarily sexualized, where people can just kind of hang out, little private rooms where people can go and have kind of private encounters or private conversations, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it's sort of this kind of really multi-form, right? Sort of like multi-purpose kind of space, but at the center of it is clearly relationships, sexuality, exploring desires, experimenting in fact with sort of like taking on different roles, right? And sort of rather than the kind of traditional roles that you might occupy, or more conventional roles that you might occupy outside of this club space, and so on, right? In short, if you think back to that perspective we call transgression, it's a carnivalesque space.
What's your hurry, boys?
Whoa, Nelly!
You all care to practice with me for the square dancing tomorrow?
Delighted, ma'am.
Same likewise, I'm sure, ma'am.
Now, just very quickly to go through a few sort of crucial supporting characters. There's a few others, but these are probably the ones I've identified as like super crucial to kind of keep in mind in terms of playing really interesting roles here. And then we'll talk about the main characters briefly. Supporting characters: Justin Bond, who is the trans host of the club, the Short Bus Club. And he shows up at various moments in the film to basically kind of slowly but surely take on the role of sort of wise elder, right? If you didn't quite get that, right? Sort of like the primary role that this host is playing at this club in this carnivalesque space is to kind of give periodic commentary, not only on the space itself, but kind of life itself, right? And if you'll notice, one of the kind of driving themes that he keeps coming back to is this question: compatibility. He calls it sort of like looking for the right circuitry, right, at a particular moment, or like, which, you know, sort of we would sort of, in our own kind of colloquial phrasing, think about looking for the right chemistry, obviously also at the sexual level, but also at broader levels, because this film does something more than just talk about sex. It talks about sex and sexuality in relation to other things, which is one of the things we want to talk about. But Justin Bond is like the wise elder. So crucial character, right? Looking for the right circuitry, keep that in mind. So I don't think that this ex-mayor figure, who has a brief kind of encounter and a brief kiss actually with Seth, is actually given a name in the film, but he is in fact sort of based on a real historical character, a real historical figure, Edward Koch, who was the mayor of New York in the early 1980s. And famously, and this is sort of part of the subtext of that conversation in the film, in the closet, right, for basically his entire kind of political public life. Seth, who is sort of the third actor, the sort of third character who gets introduced into the relationship of James and Jamie, who were obviously much more kind of dominant and main characters we'll talk about in a second, and becomes a kind of crucial figure in that. There's, of course, the three-way scene, but that three-way leads into a more complex kind of actual emotional engagement and sort of like relationship engagement with the gay couple, James and Jamie. And then there's the anonymous voyeur. He's never given a name in the film, who is sort of showing up at periodic moments in the film initially, and this is crucial, as simply a voyeur, right? As simply a voyeur, but then becomes involved later on in the film, right? Sort of moves from sort of anonymous voyeur status to getting involved with James, basically by saving him after the suicide attempt, and sort of basically becoming kind of caretaker for him in that kind of crucial kind of post suicide moment, right, where sort of James is really trying to come to terms with his like ongoing kind of chronic depression issues, right? And crucial thing about the voyeur is that he's basically a kind of metaphor for the filmmaker, right, in some basic sense. I mean, at a certain level, like many of our desires to sort of see what other people do, whether we're sort of willing to confess that desire or not, but at a different level, sort of the role that filmmakers play, which is like allowing you to be voyeurs, right, in watching films, right, and starting to imagine certain scenarios that maybe in real life you don't actually participate in or don't know anything about or have no sort of visual access to, and so on and so forth, right? So it's sort of a metaphor for the filmmaker himself, right? And then very quickly through the main characters, hopefully if you watch the film, this is all super clear. There's basically kind of like 5 crucial characters, 2 of which are in relationships that are confronting a different series of problems, right? There's James and Jamie, the gay couple, who are both struggling with James's kind of chronic depression, Jamie's apparent perhaps kind of codependency, like really kind of very, very dependent in terms of this relationship with James. And they go through this process throughout the film of basically kind of starting to contemplate opening up the relationship, which in fact they do, right? Initially to Seth, and then at the very end of the film, the suggestion is perhaps even to the voyeur, who's now become involved with James, right? Sophia and Rob, who clearly sort of start out like one of the sort of opening scenes is them having quote unquote amazing sex in all the radical 101 positions, right? Sort of suggesting to you that they have an amazing sex life. Very quickly we understand that they're a heterosexual, married, monogamous couple. Sophia at least has never been with anyone else. And that sort of initial kind of appearance of like radical sort of like satisfaction, right? Sexual satisfaction starts to unfold in a much more complicated fashion, right? They start to actually ask the question of whether or not they're actually compatible, right, with each other. Sexually and perhaps in other ways as well, right? So there's a sort of the initial pretense of representing sort of the most normative kind of sexual encounter, heterosexual, married, monogamous, right? While even that most dominant sort of normative narrative starts to unfold and get way more complicated as the movie moves forward, right? And we'll talk more about some of the details of that in a bit. And then there's this character, Severin, who is a professional dominatrix and kind of, as the movie progresses, sort of tortured artist figure. She has an interesting role insofar as like kind of one of the primary sort of things that's happening with her is that she can engage in sexuality both casually and, as a professional, right, as a sex worker, fairly easily, but she basically is struggling with having any sense of like emotional connection. Okay, so main storyline, things to kind of keep in mind, because we want to kind of delve into some of the more kind of nuts and bolts of sort of what make this an interesting and kind of subversive film. But basically lay out some of the main storyline first to make sure we're all on the same page. First of all, in case it wasn't clear, hopefully it was, if you're sort of categorizing this within the kind of broader series of genres, and there's only so many genres that storytelling kind of takes in kind of like the modern kind of filmic world, this is a search narrative, clearly, right? Sort of like all of these people, all of these main characters are on a search for something, right? They're trying to find something that will, in some basic sense, kind of resolve whatever it is that's sort of creating a series of obstacles or frustrations for them, right? So the question is like, okay, they're all on kind of different kinds of searches. The search for what, right, is the kind of crucial question, and we'll get into some of that in just a second. What I think personally makes this film quite unique, right? Because it's not unique to center a story around, say, a non-normative form of sexuality, a gay couple or a gay person, right? A lesbian, etc. Obviously, we're overwhelmingly presented constantly with imagery and stories around heterosexual relationships and heterosexuality in and of itself. But what I think personally makes this film quite unique, and then I fail to sort of come up with kind of like other interesting alternatives to substitute for it, is this second crucial thing. They're all in searches that in theory look different, but in practice, as the narrative moves forward, as the film moves forward, starts to suggest their searches will only be kind of resolved or potentially resolved if they empathize with each other. Which is to say, the point of this film is to bring very different kinds of sexuality and sexual practices into one kind of search, right? Or into one kind of storyline. So what happens very soon in the opening of the movie is that it starts out as if it's three separate stories. Sophia and Rob, James and Jamie, and Severin, right? As if they're kind of living completely separate lives and representing very different spheres, like the sex worker, the gay couple, the heterosexual married couple. And then very quickly those stories start to interweave, right? And suggesting that like once they begin to interweave, they both start to confront the problems that are latent and implicit in their different lives and relationships and sexual kind of life, and might actually have a better chance of kind of discovering potential solutions to those things and getting past those obstacles if they allow themselves to enter that dialogue, right, with other kinds of people, with other kinds of relationships, with other kinds of sexuality, right? So it's a dialogue of sexual difference is basically what I'm saying, right? Given that a search narrative that sort of starts to interweave different kinds of relationships and different kinds of sexualities that have their own kind of built-in, implicit, kind of latent problems that need to be addressed, necessitates what many search narratives and other kinds of storytelling kind of typically does, and people's life stories actually typically does, breakthrough moments, right? So sort of some of the kind of breakthrough moments where sort of suddenly you kind of move forward and get a little bit closer to resolving the problem or addressing the problem or confronting the problem, and so on, right? So there's a series of different kind of interesting, very symbolic and very sort of like kind of narrative climactic moments, breakthrough moments. Clearly, in case this was, I'm sure this was incredibly clear. I'm not going to say in case it wasn't clear. It was incredibly clear. Sophia is on a journey to have her first orgasm, right? This is a reference, amongst other things, to the kind of broader problem, right, which is called the orgasm gap, which we'll talk a little bit more about in just a second. But she's on a search throughout the entire film to try to have her first orgasm after being sort of placed in a position where initially to James and Jamie she confesses that she's pre-orgasmic. And basically that storyline is probably the dominant one that takes place through the entire film. And it's not until the very end of the film, after she's experimented with a variety of different things, right? The brief hookup with Severin, the brief kind of encounter. She has this kind of back and forth kind of flirtatious relationship that's developing in the space of the club to this other heterosexual couple, right, who's having sex at various different moments in the club space, who she eventually kind of engages with, right, in a short kind of threesome. But if you notice, there's multiple points at which these things are getting frustrated, right? She gets frustrated in the hookup with Severin. She gets frustrated by herself, right, trying to please herself, right, in the bathroom scene. She gets frustrated in this kind of fantasy moment where she's like going through the thicket of woods and coming out to a beach scene where presumably she has achieved the right amount of calm and tranquility to kind of carry out this kind of, you know, this sort of act of self-pleasuring basically, and still fails, right? And sort of, you know, this moment of like intense frustration, series of sort of looking for the breakthrough. The very end of the movie, what happens? Screen blacks out and she's clearly having, by herself, all right, and that's crucial, her first orgasm, right? So it's really about her figuring out her own body, all right? Figuring out her own body at the end of the day. All these other people kind of can help, kind of contribute to that, or like sort of push her along the way a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's about her coming to terms with her own body, right? And that's crucial, right, in terms of the kind of gender and sex politics of what that's supposed to sort of suggest to us. The other kind of probably crucial breakthrough moment clearly is James's suicide attempt, right? Failed, as it turns out. Fortunately, suicide attempt. This is a guy who, you know, is presented slowly but surely, is also a kind of tortured artist, but somebody who's just simply struggling really hard with like chronic depression, right? And that has a fundamental impact on the relationship he's in, right? And so the failed suicide moment is another kind of, because it sort of incorporates a new actor. The anonymous voyeur suddenly is the person who saves him, takes him back to his apartment. They have their own kind of tense, but ultimately kind of productive sexual encounter. And at the end of the film, like, we don't really know what James and Jamie's and Seth and now the voyeur's lives are going to look like. But by the end of the film, in the last shot of James, he's smiling, finally, right? Suggesting potentially some kind of perhaps at least initial breakthrough past this kind of really, really depressive episode that he's just gone through, right? So sort of breakthrough moments as sort of like these very symbolic moments where where the people who are on these searches trying to resolve these issues and obstacles are looking for the outlet, like looking for the solution, right? Okay, so I want to ask a couple of questions about this film and delve into a little bit more kind of the detail, right, of some of the story and the way that the film is shot and even edited, and so therefore the kinds of representations that you're actually seeing. Basically, two questions. The first question has to do with like how Short Bus both can challenge mainstream film, sort of, box office kind of big theater splash kind of film, and mainstream pornography at the same time. Well, the first of those, somewhat obviously, you can't really do one or the other of these things if you don't choose the right medium and sort of and act within the right sphere. So the sphere of independent or kind of art film, which is clearly where this is placed, is crucial in that sense, right? It's purposely sort of, autonomous and independent from gigantic sort of multi kind of $1 million production companies on the one hand. This also has consequences. You don't have access to like mainstream Hollywood talent if you don't have big budgets and so on and so forth. So it's independent like financially, but it's also with that comes like a series of kind of directing and editorial and production sort of choices where you can choose to represent a story in a different way if you're not sort of beholden to kind of big Hollywood kind of corporate sponsors, right? While I'm sure some people, because of the non-simulated sex, would think of this as potentially somehow pornography, we're going to kind of go into a series of other things here that would, I think, strongly make the case that it is not on a variety of levels, despite the choice to use unsimulated sexuality. So it's in this kind of weird, ambiguous place in between, precisely in part because it's an independent film. It's sort of riding that line. Second, it places, instead of like sort of deciding to focus on this or that kind of sexuality, we have a multitude, obviously, of representations of heterosexuality and its relationships and its sort of relations to people's relationships, their emotional life, their romantic life, their social life. There's a multitude of those, right? It's unquestionably the dominant kind of representation. At this point in the game, there are also, of course, representations which challenge that by, say, a film or a storyline that focuses on a kind of alternative or non-normative form of sexuality and or relationship, a gay couple, a gay protagonist, a lesbian protagonist, those kinds of things. But one of the things that I think this film does that's different from that, of sort of shifting the focus to a non-dominant, kind of non-hegemonic group, a sort of sexual minority in that sense, is actually putting all kinds of different sexualities into one single storyline. That, for me, is what kind of really marks this film as different, right? It's placing normative heterosexuality that turns out has its own problems into dialogue with a gay couple, right, that have their own problems, into dialogue with a person who is working in the professional sex work industry, right? And sort of, and many different things in between, particularly once they kind of go into the space of the Short Bus Club, right? And all kinds of sexualities are in fact represented, right? Sort of that sort of placing into dialogue all of the different sexualities into one storyline strikes me as quite unique and something that I really struggle to find another example of, right? Rather than just kind of shifting the focus over here to this particular group or what that group does, right? And so on and so forth, right? How life is for this particular sexual minority, so on and so forth, right? What's really interesting about this film is the way it interweaves these stories together to suggest they have something to talk about, all right, amongst themselves, if they'll open up and actually do the dialogue, right? Third thing here that I'm noting, sex is part of kind of broader life stories. This is another really clear marker of this not being pornography. Pornography only shows you the sex, okay? It only shows you the sexual performance. It only represents to you like the sex right from the get-go, right? and often very specific kinds of ways in terms of how it's shot and edited and represented to you visually. But here, precisely the opposite is the case. The whole point of this film, right, or another whole point of this film, is you can never fully separate sex and sexuality from people's broader lives, okay? From the relationships that they're having or not having, even if it's a casual sexual encounter, of which there are one or two kind of represented here. There's the before and the after, right, of that casual encounter, like how people build up to it. That build up to the sort of gay three-way scene is very interesting to watch, because they're like really kind of awkward and nervous, and it's not clear it's going to actually happen, and they almost kind of give up, and then they decide to do it anyway, right? And it turns out okay. Right? But like sort of the before and after is something that you don't get in pornography, all right? You only get like the sex in the middle, right? With no explanation of how these people became sort of involved in a sexual encounter in the first place. Like that's what pornography is. Direct to the action, doesn't care to present to you the before, the after, the why, the how, all of those kinds of things, right? Much less these other things that this film is doing, right? Not just the sort of immediate kind of before and after of a particular sexual encounter, people's life stories, the relationships they're in, the friendships they have, the emotional struggles that they're having, right? Or the emotional obstacles that are inevitably going to present obstacles, not just to a relationship, a romantic relationship. That's what's happening between James and Jamie, clearly. That's at some level what's happening between Sophia and Rob. Although they're really sort of confronting the question of their compatibility, their sexual compatibility. So sort of connecting sex and sexuality and different kinds of sexuality to people's broader life stories, okay? And even for that matter, the immediate kind of life story of like, how did you end up having sex with that person, right? How did you come out of it? What did good things or bad things come out of it, right? Pornography is never going to present to you the bad things, right? It's going to just try to convince you that what you're seeing is inherently kind of erotic, right? And inherently kind of appealing, right? It's trying to do that at least, right? Never complexifying it more, that like people have bad sexual encounters. They have just simply awkward sexual encounters and so on and so forth, right? Okay, fourth thing here, representational practices. This is a very broad thing and we could kind of go on and on and on and on, but a few things I want you to think about in terms of the choices made. Choices are made in mainstream film and mainstream television. Choices are also made in the sort of world of pornography. Here there were also a series of choices made in terms of how to actually visually represent, like how to shoot, how to edit, how to put together the different sort of visual scenes and so on. And I want you to sort of think about those just at that level, right? So that if on the one hand you have sort of the simulated sexuality that you get in mainstream film and television, where it's really clear to the viewer, unless they're really dumb, that these people are not obviously having sex, right? And all kinds of props and things kind of come into play to make it kind of clear, really, that they're not really having sex. Most cliche of which is like sort of, having the sheets pulled up around their body, right? As they get up to go to the bathroom after sex, or as they're actually having sex, as if people actually do that when they're having sex. Clearly not, right? Just a kind of really dumb kind of cliche example, but like really just repeated ad infinitum, right? On the flip side, there's all kinds of choices made in pornography that we started talking about last week. The intense close-up shots of genitalia and the way genitalia interact, right? In various different kinds of sexual actions is a mainstay of mainstream pornography. Like they want you to be as close to the action as possible on the assumption that that's where you want to be. That's where your sight and mind wants to be, right? And in that sense, it also produces a kind of fragmentation of the body, right? You're sort of by doing an intense close-up, particularly on genitalia, you're like removing other parts of the body, right? That are also involved, right? In the sexual encounter. This film, I think, if you pay attention, is doing something very different. There is unsimulated sex on the one hand of a variety of different kinds, but in essentially almost every shot of this and editing of this, there's never really a very intense close-up. Or to the extent that there is, they kind of come and go very, very quickly. And generally what you're speaking is more kind of broad, kind of zoomed out, almost at times kind of landscape shots of sexual encounters and sexual activity, like sort of taking into account the full body, right? Which symbolically is also in line with what the film is suggesting, which is our sexuality and the kind of sexual practices that we engage in are always connected to other things, not only our entire body, but our entire sense of self, the way that self is related to another person that we're having sex with and or potentially in a relationship with, right? And all of the different kind of things that come into play, right? So sort of visually zooming out and showing the full bodies in these various kinds of scenes, rather than choosing sort of intense close-ups, is its own kind of representational choice. Like let's broaden out and sort of see sexuality in its much kind of broader field, right? In terms of the kinds of things that it's related to: emotional life, relationships, problems that occur in relationships, the before and the after, right? All of those kinds of things. In addition to the fact that like your entire body is involved in sex, right? Not just your genitalia, okay? So this sort of, when porn kind of pushes you in that direction, it's asking you to kind of start thinking in radically kind of fragmented ways about sexuality and about bodies, about the representation of bodies, right? In fact, a lot of porn performers are sort of trained, at least the professional ones, right, are trained to sort of like position their bodies in certain ways to give the camera access to those close-up shots and spaces that otherwise oftentimes are not visible if you're just sort of engaging in sex, quote unquote, naturally without an awareness of or direction from a person who's holding a camera, right? So there's a series of different kind of sort of actual representational practices and choices being made in this film that are neither porn nor mainstream film. Last one, and then we're going to move on to some slightly different question. There's a series of different kind of normative dimensions, normative kind of common assumptions about sexuality that are being challenged in this film. And again, to go back to that point, being challenged through the lens of a search narrative in which different kinds of searches representing different kinds of sexualities are being asked to enter into a dialogue with each other rather than maintain kind of in separate columns, right? Or sort of conceptualize themselves as existing in totally separate spaces, right? So a couple of the kind of more dominant sort of things that might be sort of hopefully somewhat obvious to you. Sophia's search for an orgasm, okay? So notice the progression that happens in this film. At the outset, we are presented with this heterosexual, married, monogamous couple, like the pinnacle, basically, of normative sexuality. It's initially presented by the filmmaker as if it's awesome, right? They're sort of having sex in all of this variety of different ways and all these different positions. They're sort of, projecting this image as if it's totally awesome. And what starts to unfold is that actually you can be in the most normative kind of relationship, right? Heterosexual, married, monogamous, okay? All three of those things actually are important, as we saw from Gail Rubin a couple of weeks ago. You can be in the most normative kind of relationship, having the most kind of normative kind of sexuality, sort of, engaging the most normative kind of sexuality, and still be unhappy, right? Still be unhappy. Still confront obstacles, still confront, sort of questions, basically, as this film suggests, of compatibility. Like, are they actually compatible? Maybe Sophia needs something else. It turns out what she needs is to be more in touch with her own body, which I'll talk about in just a second. But even Rob, right, who probably arguably is a little bit pigeonholed into like just the dude character, by the end of the film, it's starting to suggest that he needs something else, that he's not kind of really willing to open up about with his wife, right? He wants to be dominated by a woman, it turns out, right? Which is why there's a gesture towards the potential of a certain kind of compatibility between him and Severin as the film moves towards the very end, right? All of that storyline kind of gets dropped and it's never really kind of fully resolved. But even he is sort of confronting like, maybe I'm also not sexually satisfied in this relationship. Sophia's search for orgasm is important at a variety of different levels, all right? But probably the most symbolic and in a certain sense the most real, because it's simultaneously bodily, emotional, political, social, is that it's gesturing essentially, all right, towards what's known as the orgasm gap. In surveys, sort of sexology surveys that have been done, very, very, sort of kind of data-driven kind of research that has been done, large-scale surveys, heterosexual women in particular report the lowest levels of reaching orgasm during sexual encounters. Women, compared to men, generally speaking, report fewer orgasms, but specifically, and go look it up, you'll find like articles to WebMD and to Psychology Today, like super reputable sources, right? Look up orgasm gap on Google if you don't believe me. Specifically, heterosexual women, right, who have therefore men as partners, report the lowest likelihood of having an orgasm, right, from sexual encounters. The reason I pointed out in this kind of structural sense, like really broad scale, is that the struggle that Sophia is having, right, and trying to resolve in herself is not unique to her. She's a symbol of something broader. All right, and when you ask yourself that basic question, what exactly is she a symbol of, that's much broader than herself, her own personal individual struggle to try to have her first orgasm as this film kind of proceeds. And she does, like she's successful by the end of the film. It's about the need for women to be in touch with their own bodies, all right? To be fully in touch, to sort of feel fully kind of self-possessed, all right? And feeling fully self-possessed could have political ramifications at one level, right? Obviously, or social ramifications at one level. It also can have sexual ramifications. Feeling fully self-possessed means really kind of understanding what your body wants and desires, and how to pleasure it, and or how to ask for pleasure for it, right? In sort of dialogue with whoever your sexual partners happen to be. Now, why would that be the case, right? Historically speaking. That women are more likely than men, okay, which is the suggestion that this film is making, to be have less of a sense of self-possession, or have less kind of awareness of their bodies. Why would that be? It ain't an accident, all right? Because historically speaking, at a very, very broad level, and across actually kind of culture and time and space, and up to the present in certain kinds of ways, women have been treated as objects, right? And much more so than men have. And in fact, the point is by men, right? By men. Think about how last names have historically worked. Think about what it means when you give away the bride, right? When literally the father gives the bride to the groom. This is a moment of transaction between men, where a woman is being passed from one man to another, right? The father to the soon-to-be husband, right? It has many, many manifestations. A few weeks ago, we talked about it in the context of hip-hop videos, like putting women in as simply kind of sexual adornment, basically as kind of backdrop. All of those different levels of kind of what we call the objectification of women as a historical result has kind of psychic and bodily and emotional kind of consequences, that women are less likely to be kind of fully in possession of themselves and sort of fully understand their bodies, or willing at least, right, to sort of fully kind of go and understand what their bodies need and want. Why? Because they've been forced, basically, right, historically, to articulate themselves as in the pleasure of others, right, serving for the pleasure of others. Who specifically? Men specifically, okay? So that's the broader kind of struggle that's being kind of pointed to or gestured to by Sophia's search for an orgasm, right? She has to kind of confront at both political and social, but really fundamentally also just like an individual bodily level. Do I know what my body wants? Amen. Amen. Do I know what it desires, right? And can I both articulate that for myself and articulate it to my, potential sexual partners, right? If you want to think about another kind of really kind of subversive, kind of challenging moment, I think by asking, for example, heterosexuals, and in particular men, right, heterosexual men, to watch the development of a gay relationship, and specifically that gay threesome scene, is absolutely an interesting move, right? You'll notice if you go back to it, that they start making jokes and start singing the national anthem in the act of having a three-way, right? And in a very symbolic way, singing the anthem into the other guy's butt, right? To be very blunt about it. Ask yourself what the filmmaker is trying to suggest there. Like, basically, symbolically, what he's saying is like, are you guys going to stop making fun of us for the sexuality that we practice? Right? There's a reason he picked the national anthem and not some sort of other like random song, right? The national anthem is highly, highly charged and symbolic, representative of Americanness, right? Citizenship, inclusion in some basic sense. Like, are you guys going to stop laughing at us? Are you going to stop using the word gay, for example, as an insult, right? To challenge people's masculinity, right? And by virtue of that, question implicitly or explicitly the kinds of sexual desires that we have and the kinds of sexual activity that we engage in, right? He's sort of asking people to stop, including heterosexuals, including men, heterosexual men in particular, to stop and ask themselves what's going on during that scene, right? Can you watch this scene and stop laughing? Can you see in it both the struggle of a different kind of relationship that might still have some sort of relevance for you, and the struggle to find, once again, that thing that unites us all across different sexualities, the question of compatibility. Compatibility. Second kind of key question we want to ask here, I want to sort of put this film Short Bus into dialogue with some of those key analytical ideas that we drew out of the Gail Rubin piece from a couple weeks ago. And suggest to you that what this film does really in an interesting way is kind of invert all of those the analytical kind of ideas that she throws out about the problem of sexual essentialism. In a certain basic sense, it's kind of flipping them on their head and trying to suggest we move towards a world that is different, right? So for example, instead of sex negativity, remember she talked about the general kind of bad vibes or negative emotions and negative charge that sexuality writ large, generally speaking, has. This film is incredibly sex positive, all right? It's incredibly sex positive in the sense of like one of the basic messages is like, figure out what you need, okay? Figure out what you don't hurt anybody in the process, right? But figure out what you need and look for it and try to find it, right? Because you will in fact be happier that way, right? And just accept that that's what you need and that's what you want at a sort of sexual level and the way sex relates to these other things like emotion and relationships and so on, right? Be it very short and casual or ongoing and complicated and so forth, right? A sort of an overwhelmingly kind of positive message at the end of the day. Overwhelmingly, the promise of a space like Short Bus is that maybe if you just work at it, right, and be honest with yourself and the other people who you're engaged with, sex can be a fundamentally positive force, right? And not just your life and the life of others, like the life of everybody, right? Second, instead of that kind of moral hierarchy of like kind of good to bad with like the kind of walls of contestation of where kind of the good stops and the bad starts and the ambiguous spaces in between, she's suggesting the possibility of an equal, John Cameron Mitchell, the filmmaker, right? He's suggesting the possibility of like thinking, at least it's a little utopian, maybe a little idealistic, but thinking of sexuality as potentially one day, hopefully in certain spaces, in certain ways, a kind of equal playing field, right? Where there aren't like these radically marginalized communities or radically marginalized people who practice X or Y particular kind of sex, where no one's really getting hurt, but they're constantly being stigmatized or judged for it. What if we imagine a kind of equal playing field? And the Short Bus Club is that, right? It's the potential of that. It's like sort of idealized as the potential space where that might occur, right? Since all sexualities are welcome, and no one really is getting hurt, right? At least in terms of the way the film develops, right? And they're all sort of being practiced in a sort of shared space, right? So the idea of kind of creating an equal playing field. Thirdly, experimentation instead of that other category or idea that Rubin talks about as the domino theory of peril. This idea of like by opening up this sexual door or opening up that sexual door or engaging in this sexual practice or engaging in that sexual practice, at one point, at some inevitable point, you're going to fall off the cliff and do something really bad, right? The kind of slippery slope thesis is what we also talked about it as, right? What if the inverse of that, right? The inverse of that is sort of opening oneself up to the idea of experimentation without like, the initial impulse or reaction being fear, right? Or anxiety that if I do this, I'm going to do that next, and then eventually I'm going to do something really bad. What if you open yourself up to the idea of experimentation as precisely a way to have a more positive sort of sex life, basically, and create the possibility of more kind of an equal playing field, right, with other kinds of sexuality, right? That doesn't mean me or anybody else is encouraging you to do things you do not want to do. You need to know at each point when you clearly don't want to do something. And you need to say it, right, if you don't want to do something. Absolutely, okay? But that doesn't mean you have to shut down all possibility of other things, right? That you might, in fact, be curious about or open to, and even in the process of experimenting, you can sometimes find out, oh, I don't actually want to do that. Thought I did, wrong, going back, also totally fine, right? But just don't sort of view sexual experimentation as inherently that's something that's going to inherently lead you to do something horrible, right, and dangerous, right, to yourself or others. It requires a lot of self-awareness, right, and it requires a lot of sort of open conversation and real conversation, real talk, as they say, with the people, the person or people that you are involved in, right, in any given sexual scenario, right? Absolutely. Obviously, it involves consent, okay? Last one, and we'll go out on this note. You notice the kind of last sort of idea that she closed on, that Gail Rubin did a couple weeks ago, was this notion of like, why is it that we don't have like a widespread kind of understanding of sort of like sexual relativity? Like, why is there kind of basic absence of kind of moral relativity? Why are we so quick to judge or disidentify with other forms of sexuality and other sort of sexual minorities and sexual practices? Why isn't the first impulse a certain kind of empathy and or at least a sort of relativism where you're just like, oh, you guys like to do that? Cool, right? This is what I do. This is what I like to do. No big deal, right? Moving on, right? Or a deeper level of empathy where like, oh, wow, I never thought about that. I wonder if I would like to do that. I'm not sure. Let me think about it, right? Or even identification. Okay, like I don't really want to do that thing that you guys do, but I understand why you do it. And it makes me think about this in terms of the things that I like to do, right? Sort of that, why isn't that the kind of go-to mental space rather than like, that's gross, right? Or those people are disgusting, or that thing that they do is disgusting, right? All of those kinds of very common reactions that people have when sort of standing from their own kind of moral and sexual positioning very easily start to judge others, right? Empathy, relativity, the ability to identify with even if you don't actually practice the same kind of sexual actions. Okay, see you later. That was Short Bus.
Out of sheer honesty, I demand that you tell him who you are. Well, haven't you anything to say? Anything? Out of sheer honesty?
Yes, I would just love a duck dinner.